John was tired that day after a week of hard work. His car was in the shop, so he had to take the subway, something he hadn't done in months. As he descended into the station, mingling with the crowd, he noticed a dog. In the midst of hurried steps, the dog seemed different. It wasn't just wandering aimlessly, it was waiting as if it knew exactly what to do. Apparently without an owner, with a distant gaze, the dog entered the train as soon as the doors opened, indifferent to the curious looks around. John settled into the car, keeping his eyes on the animal. People hardly noticed the presence of the dog, perhaps accustomed to such scenes, but something about it caught John's attention. Maybe it was the expression or the way it moved between the seats, ignoring the passengers. There was no doubt this dog had a purpose, but what was it? Curiosity grew. At first, John thought the dog belonged to someone nearby and was simply waiting to be called. However, no one seemed to care about it. John tried to shake off the feeling that something was off, but the image of that dog lingered in his mind for the rest of the day. As soon as he got home, the thought continued to haunt him. Why would a dog travel alone on the subway? What was the story behind that distant look? The next day, unable to shake the image of the dog from his head, John found himself back at the station, watching the passengers come and go. It didn't take long for him to spot it again. The same dog, waiting patiently. This time it looked even more worn out, its fur slightly dirty, but its posture remained the same, firm and determined. The subway arrived, and the dog boarded as before, and once again, John couldn't help but follow it with his gaze. With each new trip, John became increasingly intrigued by the dog's behavior. He tried to stay close enough to observe, but the animal seemed to completely ignore him. Something inside John urged him to find out more, to understand what made that dog ride the subway every day. There was no collar, no signs that it belonged to anyone, but its behavior was so organized that it seemed impossible it was just any stray dog. On one of the days, John decided to try to approach it. He brought a piece of bread, hoping to attract the dog's attention, but it showed no interest. John stood there holding the food, while the dog continued its routine as if it knew exactly where it needed to be. It entered the car, and John discreetly followed, feeling compelled to discover more. The journey of that dog was just beginning, and the sense that there was something profound behind that empty gaze tormented him. Sitting in the subway, John couldn't take his eyes off the dog, which once again ignored everything around it as if it were just waiting for the moment to get off. When they reached the next station, the dog jumped off as if it was its regular stop. John hesitated for a second but decided to follow the animal, even without knowing where it was going. As he observed the dog's silent determination, a sense of anguish began to form in John's chest. He followed the dog through the station, keeping a safe distance so as not to scare it away. The subway departed, and the sound of the closing doors echoed as both of them walked down the stairs. The dog seemed to completely ignore the man, focused on something ahead that John still couldn't understand. The animal crossed the station hall with firm steps, without hesitation, as if it knew exactly where to go. John, on the other hand, wondered how far that quest would take him. They reached the street and the dog continued on. People rushed by, but the animal moved with tranquility, as if the crowd and chaos around were nothing more than part of a routine it knew well. John felt a pang of melancholy watching that scene. The dog was alone, completely indifferent to its surroundings, as if nothing mattered except reaching a destination. For days, John repeated the same ritual. He took the subway, found the dog, and followed it, always hoping something new would happen, but the cycle seemed to repeat itself. The dog got off at different stations, but the patterns were the same. It was always the same quietude, the same determination. John began carrying food with him, but the dog never accepted it. It would merely glance at him briefly before continuing its journey. There was something more to that story, something John felt but couldn't quite grasp. One day, while watching the dog exit the station, a woman tried to shoo it away, lightly kicking to get it out of her path. "Get out of here," she shouted. The animal flinched for a moment but soon resumed its course, unperturbed. John felt a tightening in his chest. He quickened his pace and for the first time called out to the dog, "Hey, buddy." The dog stopped but didn't look back. John approached slowly, trying not to seem threatening. "You're all alone, aren't you?" he asked softly. The dog remained still for a brief moment, before continuing its path. That indifference hurt John in an unexpected way. There was something deeply sad about the dog's solitary routine. How could someone be so determined to reach a place, yet seem so lost at the same time? John spent the rest of the day reflecting on what he had seen, feeling that there was a mystery there, a story he needed to unravel. He decided that the next morning he would do something different. Upon arriving at the station, he called a local animal shelter. "I think I found a dog that needs help," he explained. The shelter suggested putting a tracker on the animal so they could understand its behavior and learn more about where it went every day. The idea sounded good to John, and he agreed immediately. Next day, with the help of a shelter employee, they managed to attach the small device to the makeshift collar they had put on the dog, without him resisting. It was a new step, and John finally began to feel that he was getting closer to answers. The mystery that had been haunting him now had a direction. The shelter team assured him that he would receive all the information about the dog's movements throughout the day. For the first time, John felt he was near to uncovering the truth behind that lonely journey. At the end of the day, his phone buzzed. The dog's route report arrived, and what he saw left him intrigued. The dog not only wandered through several subway stations, but always ended up at the same location, a more remote area of the city where John had never been. On the map, the location appeared to be a small house in a forgotten part of town. John decided he would go there. He arrived at the site indicated by the tracker, a quiet, distant region, almost forgotten. The streets were narrow and dark, with few houses around. The area seemed to have been abandoned long ago. The GPS pointed to a small house at the end of a dead-end street, with an overgrown garden and faded paint. This was where the dog concluded his daily journeys, day after day. He parked the car and hesitated for a moment. What would he find there? As he got out, the cold wind of the afternoon enveloped him. He walked on foot towards the house, which felt more like a memory than a living place. John didn't know what to expect, but his heart raced with each step. The metal gate was ajar, creaking slightly as he pushed it open. On the other side of the gate, the dog was there. Sitting in front of the house's door as if waiting for something, the dog noticed him but remained still, eyes fixed on the door. John approached slowly, feeling a growing weight in his chest. "This is where you come, isn't it?" he murmured. The dog, as always, did not react. John looked around, trying to understand what this place meant to the animal. The house had an air of abandonment, but there was something familiar about it. He knelt beside the dog, extending his hand, but without expecting any response. There was a deep sadness in the animal's eyes, a pain that John was now beginning to share. "What are you waiting for?" he asked, his voice barely escaping. The front door was closed, but not locked. John felt a shiver as he realized this. He stood up, glancing at the dog one last time, and carefully turned the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing an interior that had long seen no life. The floor was covered in dust, the furniture draped with white sheets faded by time. Everything was frozen in time, as if the owner of the house had left one day and never returned. As he explored, John found small signs that someone had once lived there with the dog. An old blanket on the floor near the fireplace, worn dog toys. He bent down, picking up one of the toys, now colorless and misshapen, and felt a lump in his throat. "Is this yours?" he asked, not really expecting an answer but knowing the truth. The dog remained at the door, watching. John made his way to the kitchen. There were plates and cups still on the table, as if they had been left aside on an ordinary day. But what caught his attention was a photo, framed and hanging on the wall. A smiling man was kneeling next to a dog, the same dog that had followed him on the subway. The connection between the animal and the man in that photo was undeniable. John approached, studying every detail. The man looked happy, his arm around the dog, who had the same look John now saw, only it used to be full of life. The reality of that scene hit him hard. That man was the dog's owner, and this place was their home. The dog returned here every day, waiting for someone who would never come back. John felt tears welling up, a tightness in his chest that he couldn't prevent. What had happened to the dog's owner? How had he disappeared without a trace, leaving this faithful friend alone forever? As John pondered, a soft voice echoed in his mind. It was as if the dog was silently crying out, asking for something he could not understand. John stood there, lost in thought, looking at the photo of the man and the dog. The image seemed to tell a story of loyalty, companionship, and a pain that the dog carried every day. He slowly turned to face the dog, still at the entrance, still eyes fixed on the house. John now understood what this place meant. It was the only connection the animal had to the past. He crouched in front of the dog, trying to establish some sort of connection. "You're waiting for him, aren't you?" he said, his voice choked. "But he's not coming back." The dog looked at him, not understanding the words, but seeming to feel the weight of the emotion in John's voice. In an unexpected gesture, the dog took a step forward and nudged his snout against John's hand, as if finally recognizing his presence. It was at that moment that John made a decision. He couldn't leave the dog there, trapped in an endless cycle of waiting and pain. But he also knew that pulling him away from that routine wouldn't be easy. The bond with that place was too strong. John stroked the dog's head and stood up, determined to do something different. "Let's get out of here," he murmured, almost like a promise. Carefully, he took the dog by the makeshift collar, trying to guide him out of the house. At first, the dog resisted, looking back as if still waiting for something. John felt a lump in his throat, understanding the internal struggle the animal faced. "I know it's hard," he said gently, "but you need to move on." The two walked towards the door, the dog hesitating with every step. As they left, John noticed that the dog kept looking back as if it didn't want to leave that place. "It'll be okay," John whispered, trying to convince himself as much as the dog. They returned to the car, and John decided he would take the dog home with him that night. He knew the dog needed time to understand that this solitary journey no longer had to be made. As he placed the animal in the back seat, John looked at it and realized something. This was not just a journey of mourning, it was a journey of survival, and the dog was not ready to abandon it. In the days that followed, John tried everything to give the dog a new home, a new life. He took it for walks, tried to help it adjust to the house, but each night the dog would return to the door, restless, as if waiting to be taken back to the subway, back to the old house. John's heart ached every time he saw the dog lost in its thoughts, unable to disconnect from the past. Finally, after days of trying to break that painful routine, John gave in. He put the leash on the dog and took it back to the subway. "You want to go there, don't you?" he asked as the dog looked at him with tired but determined eyes. Upon arriving at the station, the dog seemed revitalized, as if returning to a place where it understood what to do. John felt powerless. He had failed to give the animal a new life. They got off at the same station, walked the same streets, until they reached the abandoned house. When they arrived, the dog lay down in front of the door, just like it did every day. John, unsure of what else to do, sat down beside it in silence. The anguish grew within him, and he wished he could explain to the dog that its owner would not be coming back. But how do you say that to someone who lived by loyalty? Just then, something strange happened. The dog began to sniff the ground frantically, as if it were trying to find something. John stood up, confused, and watched as the dog dug in a corner near the entrance. "What are you doing?" he murmured, not really expecting an answer. John observed as the dog dug with determination, its quick movement suggesting it knew exactly what it was looking for. The hard ground slowly yielded to the dog's paws, and its expression changed, becoming more intense. There was something there, and John began to crouch down, intrigued. "Hey, what did you find?" he asked, without really expecting a reply. The dog remained focused, ignoring everything else, until its paws finally reached something solid. An object was partially buried there, wrapped in dirt and dust. With his heart racing, John began to dig alongside the dog, adrenaline driving him. When they finally unearthed what was hidden, John found himself looking at a small wooden box, old and worn by time. The dog stopped digging, merely observing, as if it had been waiting for that moment forever. John, with trembling hands, picked up the box and placed it in his lap. He felt the weight not only of the object but also of the significance it seemed to carry. "Is this what you wanted to show me?" he whispered, looking at the dog, which was now sitting with its gaze fixed on the box, almost as if it knew what was about to follow. John opened the lid carefully, the creaking of the old wood echoing in the silence around them. Inside, he found some yellowed papers and a small personal item, an antique pocket watch with a broken chain. At the bottom of the box was a photo of someone John recognized immediately. The man from the house, the dog's former owner, and a handwritten note, nearly illegible due to age. "For my faithful friend who never abandoned me." The meaning of that phrase hit John like a punch to the chest. The dog was not just waiting for its owner, it had been guarding that secret, protected by a bond of loyalty that had never been broken. The truth behind that solitary and painful journey was deeper than John could have imagined. He held the watch in his hands, looking at the dog beside him, which now seemed calmer, as if it had finally fulfilled its mission. "You kept this safe for him, didn't you?" John's voice was choked with emotion. The dog simply stared at him, its eyes finally appearing at peace. That discovery brought answers, but also an indescribable pain. The dog's former owner had not just disappeared, he had left a part of himself in that place waiting to be found. And the dog, loyal until the end, had remained faithful, guarding the secret long after its owner was gone. John took a deep breath, trying to process everything. The dog had spent the last few months retracing that daily journey, not just waiting but protecting something that meant the world to it. And now that the secret had been revealed, the burden the dog had carried for so long seemed to finally dissipate. John placed the watch back in the box, closing it carefully. He looked at the dog again, feeling an even stronger connection now. "You did what you needed to do. It's time to move on." The dog, as if understanding John's words, slowly stood up and walked over to him, nudging its nose against his hand. It was the first time the animal sought contact voluntarily. John felt tears welling up in his eyes, overwhelmed by the emotional weight of that moment. John left the house with the dog by his side, feeling the emotional weight of that recent discovery. They walked in silence down the street, and the dog seemed different now, as if a burden had been lifted from its shoulders. There was no longer that urgency in its steps, that incessant search. Still, John knew that the path to truly letting it find peace would not be easy. Over the following days, John continued trying to integrate the dog into his routine, giving it all the care and attention he could muster. But no matter how much calmer the dog seemed, there was still something that kept it distant. Every day at the same time, it would sit by the front door of John's house, as if waiting for permission to leave. Its gaze was loyal, yet filled with a deep sadness. John felt that even after discovering the secret of the box, the dog was still tethered to the memory of its former owner. One morning, while preparing coffee, John looked out the window and saw the dog sitting by the door again. He sighed, frustrated with the thought that perhaps he would never be able to bring the animal back completely. Determined to do something different, John put a leash on the dog and once again took it to the subway. Maybe, he thought, the dog needed that final trip to truly close the chapter of its grief. On the subway, while they sat side by side on the bench, John looked at the dog with a mix of sadness and understanding. "I know you miss him," he said softly. "But I'm here now. We can do this together." The dog looked back at him, its eyes expressing a silent resignation, but still lacking the complete surrender John hoped for. They got off at their usual station, but this time John didn't follow the dog home. Instead, they stopped at the entrance of the station, where he unhooked the leash from the dog. "If you need to go back, I'll understand, but if you want to stay, I'll be here." For a moment, the dog stood still, looking toward the house, as if contemplating its next move. John's heart tightened. What if he could never earn the trust of that animal? What if the bond with the past was too strong to break? The dog took a step toward the street, and John held his breath. Then something unexpected happened. The dog stopped, looked back, and in a slow gesture, returned to John, resting its head against his leg. It was a simple movement, but one filled with meaning. For the first time, the dog chose John. John knelt down, hugging the animal tightly. "We're going to be okay," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "I promise." They returned home, and that day, something had changed. The dog no longer positioned itself by the door. Instead, it lay down near John, as if it had finally decided that this was its place. The journey was over. In the days that followed, John and the dog's lives began to take a new direction. The dog, which he had decided to name Max, became more present, more affectionate, as if the pain that had kept it bound to the past had finally dissipated. Max followed him everywhere around the house, his steps now calm, devoid of the urgency that once marked his journey. One morning, while they were walking in the park, John found himself reflecting on how much that animal had changed his life. He, too, carried his own emotional scars, and Max's presence seemed to fill a void he hadn't even realized was there. "You've helped me just as much as I've tried to help you," John said, stroking the dog's head, which looked back at him with calm eyes. However, that same night, when everything seemed to be returning to normal, something unexpected happened. Max began to act strangely, restless, as if he was searching for something again. He paced back and forth, growling softly at the front door, as if he heard something John couldn't perceive. "What is it, Max?" John asked, concerned. Max, with determination in his eyes, approached the door, nudging it with his nose. John hesitated, but decided to follow the dog's instinct. He opened the door and Max bolted outside, as if he had a clear objective. John grabbed his keys and ran after him, his heart racing, trying to understand what was happening. Max raced through the streets with a speed John hadn't seen in a long time. They arrived at a nearby square where Max stopped, sniffing the air with urgency. John tried to catch his breath while watching the dog focus on something ahead. Then John saw, in the dim light of the night, a man stumbling, visibly injured. He was on the ground, breathing heavily. Max ran to the man, barking, drawing John's attention. As John quickly approached, he recognized something that left him in shock. The man, despite his injuries, had a familiar face. It was the same man from the photo he had seen in the house. Max's former owner was alive, but gravely hurt. John knelt beside the man, and Max stayed by his side, licking his hands as if he had finally found what he had been looking for. "I'm going to call an ambulance," John said, his voice trembling as he quickly dialed the emergency number. He couldn't believe what was happening. That man, whom everyone, including Max, thought was dead, was right there in front of him. As they waited for help to arrive, John realized something extraordinary. Max's loyalty, his relentless search, all made sense now. The dog had never given up because in some way he knew his owner was still out there, needing to be found. And now, after so long, that cycle was finally completing. The ambulance arrived, and the man was hurriedly taken to the hospital. John stayed with Max by his side, watching the ambulance lights fade away. Max, calmer than ever, lay down next to John as if he knew his mission had been fulfilled. "You brought him back," John whispered, stroking the dog's head. Max, with peaceful eyes, simply closed them, finally at rest. We hope you enjoyed this narrative. Please leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more soul-touching stories. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. We'd love to hear what you think, and both appreciation and criticism are welcome. See you in the next emotional video. Until then,